Okay, and in a previous lecture, we talked about Abraham Lincoln and his playing politics, his um, own opinions or personal beliefs about slavery and about racial equality. And the myth of Abraham Lincoln freeing the slaves um, is part of what remakes his ideas about race into this idea that people have that Lincoln was like a freedom fighter and fought for equality. Not true. Um, but where the idea of him being a lot of people remember that from elementary school, and a lot of children learn that Lincoln freed the slaves, Lincoln freed the slaves. Also not true. But where the idea comes from is from an executive order that Abraham Lincoln issued in 1863, at the beginning of 1863, after the U.S. had been at war in the Civil War for about a year and a half, a little over a year and a half. Um, Abraham Lincoln issues this order called the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation means freeing somebody who had been enslaved or who did not have freedom. A proclamation is an announcement. So this is, in essence, the announcement of freedom. Um, but and it's like Lincoln's other kind of famous speech um, from his time as president. Um, but though this is called the Emancipation Proclamation, announcement to free slaves, we actually look at what the Emancipation Proclamation says. It doesn't actually do that. Um, what Abraham Lincoln announces in this speech or this executive order is that he declares all slaves freed in the Confederate States, meaning the states that had broken away from the US and were no longer listening to the US government nor Abraham Lincoln, right? He's the reason they broke away to begin with. So he's essentially telling Confederate states that he knows are not going to obey his order, free your slaves. So then that means in effect on the ground, no slaves get freed as a result of that. So you think, oh, well, but the intention is he's trying to end slavery, right? He's trying to free the slaves um, uh, in those areas, even if they don't comply with his orders. Um, However, in that same announcement of freedom, he allows those border states, those states that had slavery, like Missouri and Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, those states that had slavery but didn't break away from the United States. Um, So what we're looking at is essentially the US is at war. The amount of soldiers is running low. The US has now opened up to African American soldiers to try to fill in the ranks in the military, um, and is looking to gain support from other countries, especially European countries which had already, for the most part, ended their legal slavery and had been pressuring with like various abolitionist groups around the world had been pressuring the US into um, abolishing slavery. And so the freeing of the slaves as part of this um, is part of this move that the US makes to try to win the war, right? So the war, Lincoln does not start out the Civil War with any kind of indication that this war is about ending slavery. Initially, all of his rhetoric is this war is to like reunify the United States, to bring the Union back together. But there is a recognition that if he now changes the rhetoric to play this as now a war to end slavery, it gives the U.S. more support. It gives the U.S. kind of more people who are willing to fight, opening the war up to African or the army up to African American soldiers, but also it essentially like the war has dragged on so long, so many people have been killed. There is this sense that the war needs to be for some big issue, that it can't just be, um, you know, bringing the making the South stop its secession. It needs to be for something greater. So when we say that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, this is the um, executive order people are referring to, the Emancipation Proclamation. But in effect, it didn't actually free anybody. The slaves in the Confederate States were not freed because the Confederates didn't listen to Lincoln's order. The slaves in the border states remained enslaved because if he were to free the slaves in those border states might potentially secede and join the South, and then that would kind of tip the favor in tip the balance in favor of the South in the war. So it's a lot of strategy in trying to win the Civil War, but it does change the purpose of the war to now being a war to end slavery, and it does pave the way eventually for the actions that Congress is going to make later on to abolish slavery. Though there are so many people that were in Congress that were very vocal in wanting to end slavery. And after the Civil War ends, they are going to be the ones that try to really address the problems of slavery. It's not Lincoln who is like the freedom fighter. It was a small group of people in Congress who then pushed for the 13th Amendment, which will end slavery in the U.S. Okay, but this is where we get the idea that Lincoln is the great emancipator, the freedom fighter. So the result, like I said, is no slaves are officially freed, but the goal of the war goes from reuniting the Union to ending slavery. And in addition to African Americans then getting involved in the war effort, or being allowed to by gatekeepers get involved in the war effort, sorry, women also are a big part of the war effort. And we see that in all of the wars in the United States. Even though women were not allowed to vote and have any kind of political control over what was going on, they also were not allowed to enlist in the military. But what we see over and over again is that in wartime, as men are pulled into the ranks of the military, and then especially when there's a draft, women are often expected to fill in the traditional roles of men on the home front, and that often means working in quote unquote men's jobs, or jobs that were deemed masculine. At the same time, also still filling the traditional female roles at home. You also had women who wanted to enlist in the military, of course, but couldn't. And so you have many instances of women disguising themselves as men to fight, um, as soldiers. And so you had women to, hide their identities and enlist as men. You also had women serve as nurses um, in the Civil War, and we see that in a lot of wars, in a traditionally feminine role. And so it's very much still like, even though there's like this major war effort and all these kind of mores are shifting, it still is like a definite desire to maintain traditional gendered roles, um, through only like allowing women to be like secretaries, nurses. But then you also, because women were not expected in the to be like actively in the military, they did serve as spies and scouts because they were like unsuspected in terms of like paying attention to what the men around them were talking about. Harriet Tubman, who we talked about before on the Underground Railroad, worked as a spy and a scout for the North in the Civil War. One of the nurses from the Civil War, Clara Barton, she eventually would go on to lead the founding of the Red Cross. So from her work, helping soldiers that were wounded on the battlefield, um, she helped develop the Red Cross. Okay, so some of the costs of the Civil War, um, and there are a variety of costs, it's not just economic, right? The biggest cost of any war is usually the human cost in terms of lives. The Civil War had a really high casualty rate. In most battles, a quarter or more were wounded or killed. Um, and a lot of the death in the Civil War wasn't actually from being wounded on the battlefield, like people just being killed on the battlefield. It was from two things. One, diseases that spread through military camps, um, because of lack of supplies, lack of food, like good nutrition, lack of medical care and medicine. So pneumonia and malaria killed more men in the Civil War than guns or cannons did. For every three men that were killed in battle, five died of disease while enlisted in the military and on active duty. Um, you also had like a lot of people dying from infections from their wounds because there weren't enough military supplies um, to help heal soldiers. Um, you also had a lot of soldiers, if they were wounded, the usual way they were, kind of dealt with in army camps was amputation. So, a soldier had a bullet in their arm or their leg, the fastest thing to do would be just to amputate the arm or leg. And especially because there were so many soldiers that were wounded and not enough medical staff, that by the time doctors got to any soldier that was like laying on the dirt or on a tarp or whatever, their wound would be infected and they would be like gangrene, and so they would have to just amputate the limbs. um a lot of times they did it without any anesthetic because supplies were so low, especially for the South, but for the North as well. That you just have like other men hold down the wounded soldier while the surgeon cut off their arm or leg or foot or hand or whatever while they were awake, and then they would pass out and go into shock or whatever, and then wake up and be an amputee. So in total, for both sides of the Civil War, it was 620,000 American soldiers were killed. The U.S. Civil War is the most deadly war in U.S. history. Since before the Civil War and after, there's no war in which more Americans died. Not World War II, no war did more Americans die than in the Civil War. And part of that is because both sides fighting in the war were American, right? So it's not like you're splitting the cost of life with another country. It's they're all Americans dying, but also because of the, some of the things we talked about, the advancements in war technology, the lack of supplies, um, the lack of like medical care. And if you take all other wars, if you add up from the American Revolution up to our current um, military conflicts right now, you add up all the soldiers that have died in all US wars except for the Civil War, about 645,000 soldiers in total, and just the Civil War, 620,000. So definitely the deadliest war by far. In addition to the dead, you had 400,000 who were captured or missing. So soldiers who were missing in action or who were captured and were prisoners of war. Obviously released after the war was over, but a lot of torture um, and a lot of like neglect. Like soldiers were, starved in the prisoner of war camps. And in addition to that, you had 476,000 soldiers who were wounded in some way. And of course, back then there wasn't a recognition of like, I mean, there was an idea of shell shock, which becomes more um, prevalent in like World War One and World War Two, but which we would now call PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. There was no kind of sense of that, of the trauma that could be done to the human psyche and the human mind by being in a war zone. So soldiers came back, and not only did they have physical wounds, but of course like psychic wounds that didn't get addressed either. So people came back, having lost their vision. Um, 1 out of 13 who returned had missing limbs. People were injured in a variety of ways, lifelong injuries that they had to deal with. And there wasn't a Veterans Administration that would, kind of do payouts or, support soldiers. Really, the biggest amount of money went to prosthetic limbs, so like wooden legs and prosthetic arms that soldiers could then use afterwards. 1 out of 4 soldiers did not return home. It was even more in the South. 1 out of 16 Southern soldiers died, didn't return. You had some really young people going out on the battlefield as well. And then the economic cost of the war, 6.7 billion. With that money, you could have purchased every slave out of slavery with $3 billion left over.